I guess that's one way to start a cross-examination. Day 22 of Karen Read's trial wrapped up on Wednesday, and it looks like we're getting towards the end here. Morning started off with two new motions submitted by the Commonwealth. One dealt with the resume of Burgess, and the Commonwealth saying that they were not provided a copy of the document prior to the defense cross-examining with it. But first and foremost, it's a little late to the game for this one because it'd be hard to take that away from the jury's memory. But also, the prosecution should have this as it's part of a curriculum vitae. And on top of that, they're the ones who directly didn't ask anything about his educational background. Now, why is that, you ask? Probably because they knew what they were doing. I know I can't say for sure, but there's a reason that they didn't ask about that educational background. Clearly saw in every other expert that they've had, they made it real big deal about their backgrounds, their education, and everything else. And they're equating this to basically a trial by ambush. And I definitely don't think that that's the case because they should know this about their expert witness. The second motion was in regards to what they wanted Dr. Welcher to be able to testify to. Judge Cannoni ended up ruling that Welcher cannot testify to what the prosecution wants him to, which is he cannot say definitively that Karen's SUV hit John, because that is not based in science. That is for the jurors to determine based on everything that they've seen. He can say that the injuries line up or that these things line up this way, but he cannot say definitively that Karen's SUV hit John, point blank period. And witness number 38, Dr. Welcher, was back on the stand, and Brennan asked him basically how fast this vehicle would have to go for the taillight to break. And he said if it's going over 8 miles per hour, that could happen. He said that the damage on the SUV was consistent with hitting John if it was going over 8 miles per hour. And he also said essentially that the injuries on John's arm are consistent as well, as long as the vehicle was going over 8 miles per hour. He then kind of explained what sideswiping or clipping is when it comes to collisions with motor vehicles. Then Alessi stepped up to the plate for cross-examination, and this is the weirdest beginning to cross-examination ever. Before Alessi could start questioning, Dr. Welcher basically was like, oh, and what's your full name again? I haven't heard it. Where they do that at? Who does that? It was very obvious that from that point, it was like, this is going to be a shit show. This is going to be contentious. Like, let's all get our popcorn and snacks. And you know what? It definitely was. He said that he doesn't have a dog in the fight and he doesn't care about the outcome. But at the end of the day, he does, because this is how he gets clients. Asked Welcher about essentially how he does his jobs, what mechanism he uses, what analysis he uses, all these things. And then it also came out that he couldn't do a peer review because this is a court case and he's not allowed. Scientific method is used to get the most logical answer without bias. He was asked about confirmation bias and explained that confirmation bias is essentially you are taking evidence to confirm somebody else's viewpoint without looking at contradicting evidence or other evidence. You're just going with this and calling it a day. Welcher was asked if he was familiar that the Massachusetts State Police actually have their own accident reconstruction experts, one of them being Trooper Paul, and he said that yes, he was aware. Alessi had him agree that Aperture was retained in September of 2024 and was originally giving $44,000 to essentially do the same work that Paul had already done. And remember yesterday I said, who's purchasing this SUV? He said that they purchased the SUV and they will then sell it after the trial, and then whatever the difference is, whatever the loss is, they will pass that expense on to the district attorney's office. And after it's all said and done, Aperture has been paid almost $400,000 for this part of the trial and their evidence that they've brought forward, when they have a perfectly good Massachusetts State Police accident reconstruction expert. If this doesn't go to say, y'all suck and we don't want to ever use you, I don't know what does. He was asked a lot of questions about his PowerPoint and when these changes were made, because remember, his partner, Mr. Burgess, submitted a report May 8th in the middle of trial, and now we also have, Dr. Welcher updating his presentation and changing things in it all the way up to the day before he testified, some of it being at Brennan's request. He was asked about Burgess's report on May 8th and how he knew for certain that Burgess had new info instead of info that was always there and he just didn't see it or something like that. And he essentially said, I took his word for it. My guess is he probably took his word that he had a bachelor's degree as well, but here we are. Throughout this morning testimony, there was a lot of sidebars, a lot of objections, and it really took a while to get through this thing. He was asked if based on advancements in science and technology and things like that, if the most common injury that happens with motor vehicles and pedestrians was lower body extremities. And he basically said, like, well, I can't say that for certain, but maybe, but I don't know. And the reason he couldn't agree with that statement, even though that is what science now says, is because it would change his whole testimony and viewpoint. After a lot of science and measuring questions, he agreed basically that he didn't have the data that he needed to actually say that John's eye was hit by the spoiler of the vehicle. And there was the much needed lunch break. And there was a lot of questions about calculations and how they do these calculations and how much force would be needed to break a hand bone and things like that. I got a little lost in the sauce myself based on all these calculations and numbers flying every which way. He was also asked some questions about the medical examiner's conclusion, and he basically said, look, I'm not a medical examiner. I can't say. Alessi and Welcher were essentially talking over each other so bad that Cannoni actually had to interrupt them and say, look, only one person can talk at a time. Otherwise, it's really hard to understand and things like that. And obviously they need to have a clear record for the trial court and for potential appellate reasons. And was asked a lot of questions again with calculations based on the direction that SUV was moving, the science behind it, the direction, the distance. Oh my gosh, it was a lot. He was asked about the number of people he knew to be at Fairview. Essentially, there was an objection and a sidebar call, and then they moved along. He was asked if it was reasonable or even possible that the SUV went up on the yard of 34 Fairview, and he said that it's possible, but he can't say for certain because it would depend where the car was and where it was located, the starting data and all of that. And that's a very specific data point that he does not have. He doesn't have this starting point. So I think that that takes his testimony and all of his interactions and all of his things that he's testified to. I think that that kills his testimony because he doesn't have that starting point. And that starting point is what makes everything else happen. He agreed that John's injuries are horizontal in nature. Alessi came back at him and said, well, if his arm was flexed, like you said, those injuries should actually be vertical, and they're not. Isn't that true? And Welcher is like, absolutely not. Alessi was then prompted by Cannoni to wrap up, and I was like, what are you doing? You cannot just tell these defense attorneys to wrap up. They can use as much time as they want. And they ended the questioning basically on what his confirmation bias is, if he had any, and he says that he tries to eliminate all confirmation bias in all of his testing, obviously, or so he says. The jury was then dismissed for the day, and the attorney stayed to make argument and hold another voir dire of Dr. Welcher. The defense wanted to point out that he really did use Trooper Paul's reports and drone footage and this visual aid, essentially because they want to get Paul's information in through this witness versus having to call Trooper Paul themselves. And was asked about his visuals that he used with John's injuries and stuff that had to deal and came from the medical examiner, Dr. Scortabello. Brennan had him point out that he didn't use any of the information in Trooper Paul's report or in Dr. Scortabello's report either. And then when he was asked again by Alessi, he agreed that he did use portions of the autopsy report. Cannoni said that she would continue hearing arguments and make a ruling on Thursday morning. And that wrapped up day 22 of Karen Read's trial, and tomorrow will only be a half day. This is because a juror has an appointment that they have to make too. They're so accommodating over there. But I also think it's because the prosecution is going to wrap up their case, which is pretty wild because I don't think that they've come close to meeting their burden yet. I just don't. Anyways, thanks for being here. Thanks for following along. And here's my question. If this is the last witness that the Commonwealth calls, do you think that they've left a lot off the table by the short amount of witnesses that they've called and evidence that they've presented? Let me know in the comments.